Let's talk about what happened today. And I just am actually going to just ask you to explain it. They're impeaching President Trump for a second time. They sent one article of impeachment, right? So take us through it, Neal, and just explain it to us so we can understand what's going on exactly.
Yeah, okay. So today, some members in the House of Representatives introduced an article of impeachment, one. And so that's like almost like a criminal charge, except it doesn't have criminal consequences. So if Trump is convicted, it doesn't mean he goes to jail. It means he's removed from office and he's possibly disqualified from running for office again. And so this article basically says Trump aided and abetted the insurrection, incited it, the violence that happened last Wednesday. It does not focus on the other thing that happened last week, which is Trump trying to cheat and win the elections, throw out the election results by pressuring the Georgia state officials, including Brad Rassenberger, and the 1-hour phone call and the like. That's the subject of a separate article of impeachment that Representative Omar has done has written. But the one, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, what's the status of that second article?
So it's kind of like hanging out in the back right now. So right now, I think the House is thinking about it as this one article, but the second one could come in. And I think it's a complicated dynamic, because what I think they want is to try and get a lean, mean article that a lot of people can support, including a lot of Republicans. And by expanding it, I think the thinking is maybe you don't get as many. On the other hand, what he did with Georgia was so unforgivable, and there's new evidence that's just emerging on that over the weekend, that it's kind of hard to look the other way. I think right now they've made that strategic calculation to go with one, but that could all change tomorrow.
Okay, but it needs 2/3 of the Senate to convict, right?
Correct.
That's likely not going to happen, right?
Well, that's certainly what people said last time, and it was borne out to be true, with Mitt Romney being the only one. It's not really clear here. I mean, right now only a few senators have come out in favor of impeachment. Murkowski, I think, and Ben Sass has suggested that he'd be open to consider it. But it's a different dynamic when actually people have to vote. And I do think that's part of what's going on here, which is the Democrats feel like every person should go on record. You're either on one side of this or you're on the other side. And when senators have to look at that, a year ago, they were so worried about what Donald Trump would do to them. I don't think they have that same calculus right now. And if they just ask themselves, is this someone fit to be president? It's really hard. I don't care what your ideology is. Really hard to say this is the guy who should be president or be able to run for president again.
But clearly, Neal, there are going to be holdouts like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and the people who refuted the election itself. They're not
Right.
going. They're not going to be voting. And
Right. That's the Insurrectionist Caucus, and that's not actually that big a part of the Senate. I mean, after all, if you looked at that vote, that happened right after the horrible violence on Wednesday, 93-6 in the Senate. So, Hawley and Cruz are a little bit out on their own on this. And so, obviously the question of removing or impeaching a president is different than the question of, was there election fraud? I mean, it's amazing you get 6 votes for that. I mean, I guess you could get 6 votes if Donald Trump says the earth is flat. But back in the reality-based community, I think neither of these was going to fly.
so when are they going to vote on this? I mean, can you give us some sort of timetable?
Yeah, so the latest estimates are on Wednesday morning, starting at 9 a.m. The House is going to take up this matter and will be voting that day. I mean, what we've been asked to clear our schedules for that day in the media and be ready to comment and so on. So I think it happens in the House quickly. Then the question is, when is it transmitted to the Senate? And when does the Senate take it up? And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader for at least the next few days,
Right.
has said, well, we're in recess until January 19th. And so can't bother calling people back early, which is, outrageous because this is the same guy who like jammed through a Supreme Court nomination in record time 8 days before an election. But now he's, too busy skiing or whatever.
So the Senate could consider this after Joe Biden is inaugurated.
100%.
About that. So the likely timetable might be that the House approves it, it gets sent to the Senate, but the Senate doesn't consider it until after the 20th.
Yeah, so 100% the Constitution could permit the trial to continue after. And it's a really bizarre question, which we've never had to confront, which is who presides over the trial? Because our founders in the Philadelphia Convention wrote into the Constitution that if the president is being tried in impeachment, then it's the Chief Justice of the United States that presides. But, so if the trial starts on the 19th, you could have the Chief Justice presiding. But by the 21st, I don't know that he would be presiding because it's only a former president at that point. You might ask, well, why are you thinking about impeaching a president after he leaves office? Because our founders put in the Constitution, impeachment's not just about removing someone from office, it's about disqualifying them from future office holding also.
I did some research on this, Neal, and it's my understanding, though, there has to be something specific that's voted on in addition to the conviction that does disqualify that individual from ever running again. So in and of itself, the conviction is not disqualifying.
Exactly. So, I go into this in my book, and describe how there's two different punishments requiring two separate votes. So first, a 2/3 vote to convict him in the Senate, and therefore automatically removes him. And then second, a majority vote as to whether or not he should be disqualified from future office holding. So you're right, two separate votes.
So is it possible that some people will not vote to convict, some Republicans, let's say, but they will vote to disqualify him from running again?
Yes, but I think the best way of understanding the Constitution is that you could only be disqualified after you've been removed. So you'd first have to get the 2/3 threshold, and then you can get the 50 vote threshold. There's a whole different way that you might have heard people trying to get to a Senate simple majority vote to kick Donald Trump out, which is based on the 14th Amendment in Section 3. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Thank you for that segue, because I wanted to ask you about this sort of arcane section of the 14th Amendment. We're getting into some heavy duty constitutional law, people. But the 14th Amendment, Section 3, Trump, instead of impeachment or 25th Amendment, which we're going to get to as well, could face Constitution's or insurrection ban. And a lot of Civil War historians, I wish my late husband could talk about this because he was such a Civil War freak and he would know all about this. But explain this 14th Amendment thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things about the Trump presidency is he's like bringing back all these arcane clauses in the Constitution, the Emoluments Clause, and now we're in 14th Amendment, Section 3, which, I've taught constitutional law for 20 years. I've never had to teach this. And this is the same amendment, the 14th Amendment, which Trump tried to use earlier in the administration to try and end birthright citizenship. And that very same amendment now could prevent him from ever holding office again. And so here's what it says. It says that you can't run for federal, or you can't be in federal office if you've, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. And so you look at that, obviously it was written after the Civil War, thinking about the Confederacy, but it has broader meaning to it. It's not just about the Civil War. And indeed, in 1919, we used it against Victor Berger, who was a member of the Socialist Party, to kick him out of the United States Congress. And so there is a thought, and Eric Foner, who's kind of the leading historian of Reconstruction at Columbia, is, I think, a chief proponent of this, in saying this amendment and this provision can be used to eliminate, to remove Donald Trump. And I think the argument is that he's making is by simple majority vote. If the House and Senate both say, look, you've engaged in insurrection or rebellion, or at least given aid and comfort, that those prerequisites are met. There are a couple of problems. This is why there's a debate about this. Number one, the amendment in that section doesn't really explain how to execute the amendment. It doesn't say the House and Senate are supposed to vote to bar someone from holding office. It says that if someone is barred, you need a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate to remove the bar, but it doesn't say who puts the bar on in the first instance. So that's one problem. And then another problem is there are some people like Professor Lawrence Tribe at Harvard who think that if the Congress tries to isolate a particular individual, that would run afoul of a different provision in the Constitution, in the original Constitution, called the Bill of Attainder Clause. Another arcane provision for you, and that's one that says Congress can't like go and pass a law that kind of targets you or me or our children or things like that.
So how would that work? How would the 14th Amendment in this particular section, would that be introduced by a member of Congress, or how would that work? And would that be a lengthy process? And then we'll talk about the 25th Amendment.
Right. So, again, we don't have, all of these things are so novel and new. We normally elect presidents who actually like obey the laws in the Constitution, not spit on them. So we don't have a lot of precedent. We don't know a lot of the answers to these questions. But I think the best thinking is, yes, someone in Congress could introduce a House resolution tomorrow saying Donald Trump has violated this. It could be a majority vote. And then the question is, will be a majority vote in the Senate. Now, Trump might contest it. He could try and go to court. I think he would lose in court, just as he's lost now 65 other cases in court over the last 2 months. But I think, it is something that there is some gray area and there is some room for court adjudication. And because of that, that's why, even though I do think he's violated this clause, I think impeachment's just so much more straightforward. It's clean.
What is the most expeditious route for Congress to take? And you just answered my question. It would be impeachment versus this sort of arcane section of the 14th Amendment that may be up for a lot of debate and discussion.
Well, I just distinguish between expeditious and what's the kind of strongest, clearest, and has a basis in precedent. Because this could be this 14th Amendment strategy could be expeditious. The House could vote tomorrow. The Senate could vote on Wednesday. There's no need you don't need to have a trial under the 14th Amendment. There's nothing that specifies that. Whereas impeachment would require a trial in the Senate. So the downside of impeachment, which is why you hear people talk about the 14th Amendment remedy or the 25th Amendment remedy, the idea that Pence could declare with the cabinet Trump unable to discharge the duties of his office. The reason why you hear those is because those are actually quicker.
Okay. I'm just going to tap a couple. I haven't done this before, you guys. Usually I take questions from comments, but then they hide Neal's pretty face, and I don't want to do that. So let me try this. It was, if the Senate doesn't convict Trump, Trump can still run in 2024, right?
He can run for anything he wants. I don't think he can win an election for dog catcher at this point. Maybe he could win in Russia, but I don't know. But I don't think, I think the case for impeaching and disqualifying Trump from future office holding is not this guy's actually able to win in 2024. It's really what are our most basic foundational values? Is this someone we think should be entitled to the privilege of even running for an office? Or should we make that statement that people like this are off the table in our democracy? So that to me is the case for it. It's not a realistic thought that he could really win in 2024.
Okay. I think this covers your face, which I feel bad, so I won't keep it up. Adriana just told me this does cover your face. Someone's asking, can you wake up Vice President Pence? I think he's suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. Okay, let's talk about the 25th Amendment and where Mike Pence stands. And let me get rid of that question so it doesn't cover your face, Neal. I'm trying to get it, Adriana, but for some reason it's staying there. Sorry about that, Neal. I'll keep working on it.
Here, I can go like this.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Okay, so let's talk about the 25th Amendment. That sounds like kind of a non-starter at this point, correct?
Well, probably. Vice President Pence has shown really no willingness for 4 years to do anything to stand up for the Constitution or rule of law, except for
Well,
obviously one thing on Wednesday, um, which was frankly the barest minimum. Like, yeah, he had like two kooky lawyers, Rudy Giuliani and someone else say you could do something else, but really nobody who knew anything said Pence could actually throw out the votes of over 100 million Americans and decide the thing himself. That was crazy. But yes, he gets some sort of, slow clap for doing that. But I think, basically, exactly, like, you look up the definition of an invertebrate in Wikipedia, and I think it has a picture of Pence. And so I don't think, the 25th Amendment, which does require the vice president plus a majority of the cabinet to remove a sitting president. I just think that's a hard thing to imagine, but it's not impossible. And again, I think everyone should go on record. This is one of the things I really liked about what the House tried to do today. The House tried to basically force a 25th Amendment vote and say, we think that the 25th Amendment should be kicked in. And I understand there's, some kind of procedural, like, should really the Congress be telling the vice president what to do? I can understand that as a basis for an objection. But I do like the idea. Every member of the cabinet, they should be able to hide in the shadows or resign and run from this vote, which is what 3 of them, I think, have done at this point.
I mean, it seems to me that the people who are likely to support invoking the 25th Amendment, Elaine Chao, then the guy, the head of Homeland Security, who just stepped down. I don't know the boss and what that situation would have been, but what happened when they asked people to go on record from the cabinet?
Yeah, I mean, they just don't. They just, they express their concern about what Trump said and so on, but they haven't actually formally taken positions. And I think that's really a shame. I mean, one of the kind of key ideas in our Constitution that our founders had is that our leaders should be accountable, popular accountability. And the only way you get true popular accountability is when your leaders say, here's what I think, here's what I'm willing to do. And if they can just like hide and not say anything and be in their tortoise shells, then we don't have any real say into what our government is. And so, I do think it's a real problem. I think every member of the cabinet has to be on record. And it's not good enough to like resign and then say, oh, I would have invoked the 25th Amendment. Do it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't sound like there are a lot of profiles in Couric in the White House right now willing to put their, make their vote public or their feelings known. Hey, we have a lot of questions from social, but before we do, the Molnar family has been inundating my phone with texts to each other about disbarring Rudy Giuliani. What's your family been saying about that, Molnar?
David said that it's being taken up, wherever he's a member of the bar.
Tell us about the latest on Rudy Giuliani getting disbarred.
So I think that, and there might be some new reporting on this that's just happened, but earlier in the day, there was a fake report that said that he was under bar investigation. But what that was the New York State Voluntary Bar Association, not the one that licenses attorneys, but rather the kind of social club. And yeah, I suspect that Rudy Giuliani will be barred from most social clubs.
Practicing law, Neal, is that bar too high, so to speak?
It's always a dicey question about, when discipline is used and when it's not. It does seem to me like the statements that he made on the Capitol last Wednesday are really different than filing the kind of frivolous lawsuits that he's been filing. That puts him in the insurrectionist camp. That's a problem for a lawyer. I mean, I'm not going to opine as to what the right answer is there, but it certainly does seem that's the kind of thing you would open an investigation about.
Well, he's been obviously doing some incredibly misleading things, doctoring videotapes, spreading falsehoods about election workers. So sounds pretty serious to me. Someone asked, what are the pros and cons of going to, we'll do this quickly because I know you don't have all the time in the world, and I'm hungry, Neal. What are the pros and cons of going to trial now versus waiting for the first 100 days of the Biden presidency?
So I'm going to talk about that on my thing courtside tonight, which is you can watch on Instagram. But that's what I'm going to talk about is some of those pros and cons. So I'll record that in about an hour. I think it's a hard call because if you're Vice President Biden, you would just like to start your presidency, darn it. I mean, there's so much to do between coronavirus and the economy and people suffering and the minimum wage being where it is and the environment and so on. And to have to be saddled with this is a problem for the president-elect. Absolutely. I mean, cabinet nominees, getting them confirmed. And the Constitution presupposes that impeachment will be the kind of chief order of business of the day if there's a trial. And so Vice President Biden has asked the Senate parliamentarian, can you have like the first morning be about impeachment and then the afternoon be about everything else, or vice versa, switch the mornings and the afternoon. But I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And indeed, we did that in the last impeachment because the Chief Justice, after all, was presiding over oral arguments at the Supreme Court. And so impeachment started in the afternoons. And so there may be a similar strategy that is available here. On the other hand, and this may just be idealistic Neal talking, but these are the most foundational questions we have as a society, which is, what do we think our president what are the ground rules for a president? What are the red lines that a president can't cross? And yes, I understand that it may undermine some of the president's agenda in the first 100 days, but I also just kind of feel like as Americans, this is what it's about. And, it's a shame. It shouldn't take very long, this trial. I think it could take a day or two. But I think we should do it.
As long as it, in my opinion, this is Katie talking, as long as it doesn't interfere with getting this pandemic under control. I think that should be the first order of business, getting the vaccine distributed, making sure there's enough of the vaccine. I would hate to see businesses continue to suffer, people obviously first and foremost continuing to die, and hospitals overrun, healthcare workers. I mean, it seems to me, Neal, that's pretty urgent too. I understand what you're saying about our fundamental principles, but Jesus Christ, I mean, we got to get this.
You'll get no disagreement from me on that. I think, so most of the stuff we're talking about there about vaccines and so on, that's all stuff that isn't Congress anyway at this point. It's all the administrative agencies, the Health and Human Services, the Executive Office of the President, all that kind of stuff. Now, when you start thinking about stimulus relief and the fact that people got a measly little check of $600 and it should be a lot more, when you talk about the minimum wage increasing or relief for small businesses, yes, a lot of that's going to require legislation. I just think also those debates should be truncated. And, we don't need to the idea that we're going to have a long debate about a $2,000 stimulus check or increasing the minimum wage to $15 is just insane to me. I mean, this is a no-brainer.
Let me go to a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. I've got, I'm so pleased, it's probably your followers, but I have a lot of smart people who follow me too, and it always makes me feel so good. Somebody said, I've seen differing reports on the constitutionality or not of Trump pre-pardon himself. And we've talked about this, Neal. Is he eligible for criminal prosecution for treason for the coup/insurrection attempt? If not, what can he be charged with?
Yeah, so, we don't know all the facts. And so we know what Trump said, but we need to know his state of mind. And that's an important part of many of the criminal offenses, not necessarily all of them, but some of them. And so there are both federal charges that are available. There also may be DC local ones that are available. And indeed, the DC Attorney General today said that he was going to open an investigation of Donald Trump. And so
a pardon does not protect him from a state or a DC offense, correct?
That's an interesting question, which I haven't gotten to the bottom of. So it's definitely the case that it doesn't prevent him from a state prosecution. So right now, there's a grand jury in New York that's investigating him for financial fraud. And for that, it doesn't, he can't pardon, the pardon doesn't extend to that no matter what. DC is a different animal because the language of the Constitution is that you can pardon someone for a quote offense against the United States. And is DC part of that or not? Because it is a federal territory. I don't know that it's ever come up, but I will try and find out.
That's a good argument for DC statehood, Neal.
Oh, I mean that, and actually, you
The
really last week because every governor can call the National Guard out themselves. We had to wait for these joker, political hacks at the Defense Department to finally agree to do the right thing many, many hours later. So it's argument number one, and on day one, yeah, I hope there's a Senate impeachment trial, but I also hope that the Senate takes up DC statehood.
Okay. Okay. Trump engaged in insurrection against the Constitution of the United States under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I guess this is what we're talking about. Wouldn't a resolution by a simple majority of Congress? That's the thing we were talking about earlier. Okay.
Correct.
If he is impeached a second time, and I'm assuming convicted, because I think people use impeached,
Right.
and that's just like charged and not convicted, right?
Correct.
But if he's impeached a second time, I'm going to add this, and convicted, will he lose his pension, travel allowance, and Secret Service protection?
So I understand the answer to that is yes. I haven't looked it up myself, but I think there's a 1958 law that says that. But I'm not an expert in that, but I have read that other people talking about that.
Okay. Anything else you want to tell us? Any juicy scoops or interesting things that you share before we say goodbye?
No juicy scoops. Just, it's a pretty sad thing to have a president impeached twice in a year, within a calendar year. Or a full year, and we've never had a president impeached twice. And I think all of us need to look into our hearts and think, how the heck did this happen, and make sure it never happens again. And this is not about politics at all. This is you could be as conservative and as one wants, but this is just about wanting to send people into our government who have respect for our basic foundational laws.
Do you know anybody who still works at the Justice Department or it has any kind of contact with what's going on inside the White House? It just must be a wild scene in there. I think that Trump is hunkered down. He hasn't mentioned the coronavirus, I don't think, since the election. I may be wrong about that, but it certainly has not been something he's discussed. It sounds like it's chaos and disarray inside there with nobody in charge. Do you think Mike Pence is taking up the slack and sort of running the government? What the heck?
I think it's just on bad autopilot, which is why we see the vaccine roll out the way it is and so many other things. And, I don't have people at the Justice Department who are in touch with people at the White House, because most people at the Justice Department, except, most people, they tried for so long, the career officials, to stay and hold out. But it was hard against this lawless administration. And so the few people who are left, the career people, I think are so excited about Judge Merrick Garland coming in. I can't tell you, that is, from the Justice Department standpoint, a complete home run. This guy stands for everything about the ethos of the department. And so people are excited about that, but people are worried about the next, week and a half. And you're absolutely right. Trump hasn't been worried about coronavirus. I don't think he's mentioned it. He has mentioned that he's upset he lost his PGA golf sponsorship and things like that. That's what we hear about, but we don't hear about the stuff that actually matters to America.
And finally, in Washington, are you getting greater insight into how this whole day of insurrection unfolded? If there was any kind of complicity with law enforcement, who gave an order to stand down, if in fact that order was given, why the DC police weren't asked to come, why Larry Hogan's offer of sending Maryland forces in for reinforcement, why the National Guard, it took so long. All those questions about preparedness and response are still kind of out there. have you gotten any kind of better understanding of those questions?
That's outside of my lane, so I'm just reading the same stuff you are. I think it's going to be a long investigation, and a lot of stuff's going to turn up, and it's going to be really ugly, and there has to be consequences.
Yeah, you have to wonder who was, if anyone, was coordinating the response from inside the White House, and there was some kind of
Right. But this is where the Trump, incompetence might actually save them. It might not be malicious. It might just be good old Trump White House incompetence, and not, trying to give aid and comfort, at least on some of those officials. We'll have to see. That's why I think the whole question of what are the criminal charges going to be is going to be very hard. And we can't do that without our prosecutors evaluating all the evidence, all the records and the like.
Well, whether it was incompetence or something more nefarious, it had deadly consequences.
100%.
It's something that really needs a 9/11 type investigation.
100%. Our capital was invaded by these folks for the first time since 1814. Absolutely.
All right, Neal. Always.
Okay. Great to see you.
If you guys like what you see, subscribe right here.